Ephesians chapter 4, verses 16 to 24 is our passage. We are beginning this week a sermon series on acceptable sins. Acceptable sins, which is an oxymoron, I know. It's a contradiction. Sins are not acceptable. So why have I titled this sermon series Acceptable Sins? Because I have noticed that there are things that get me really, really worked up. And there are other things that should get me really, really worked up, but don't. And I probably have shared this story with a few of you before. I'm sorry to repeat it, but nothing struck home to me the way that COVID has shifted my values and my perceptions as an encounter I had at the grocery store one day. And it just threw a spotlight onto how this time of COVID has shifted the way I see the world and the way I think about the world. I was in the grocery store in the Sioux, and we were going through, and you know how the produce section of the first, because you go through that first. So I went going through the produce section, and as I was going through, I heard someone coughing in the background, and I didn't really think much of it. It's like, yeah, that's we're all very conscious of the coughing, and as I kept going through, the coughing continued and continued. And you know how now when you hear someone coughing and they don't stop, and you sort of check to see, is that person okay? Like, we're very aware of coughing now everywhere we go. And this person was coughing, and I turned and I saw, and it was an older lady, and she wasn't wearing a mask. And I thought to myself, oh my goodness, I can understand she's probably struggling. I can understand the mask is, maybe it's challenging for her to wear. So I'm not going to be too judgmental on that. But you really shouldn't come to the grocery store without a mask and cough on everybody's fruit. So maybe you think I'm a bit of a fascist for saying something like that, but that's just sort of how we've been. A lot of the conditioning we've been receiving is, if you're coughing, if you're not feeling well, don't go out, and certainly don't go out without a mask and cough on in a public space like that. And I said, you know what, I'm going to extend some grace here. And you know what, remember, Jesus reminds me there's lots I need to be forgiven about, so maybe I'll work on that log before I worry about the splinter in my neighbor's eye sort of thing. So I let it go. It was fine. It didn't ruin my shock being experience, and I didn't get COVID from that lady as far as I know. But I kept shopping, and I went further down and further down in the aisles, and there was a couple younger people. I would guess they were in their late teens, early 20s. And I walked past them, It wasn't until I was past that I realized they were using extremely, we'll call it colorful language just in the grocery store. And it didn't even really register with me until I got to the end of the aisle and I saw a mom with some young kids. And I'm like, oh, I should really say something about that. I wouldn't want to have to explain to my small children what those words meant in the grocery store. Why is that lady talking like that? And as I finished my shopping and went back to the car, it struck me. The woman coughing in the produce section bothered me more than the teens who were using their vulgar language in the aisle a few things down. And again, I'm not going to suggest to you that I should have just walked right up to those kids and said, listen, you can't talk like that. I'm not suggesting I should have been policing the aisles. But what I'm saying is I recognized in that moment how my values had shifted during COVID. The things that bothered me had changed dramatically. We as churches often harbor acceptable sins in our fellowships. Things that ought to bother us, but don't. Things that we ought to recognize as grieving the Spirit of God which is invested in us. He is here and we grieve Him, we put out His fire, but we don't recognize it because those are the quote-unquote acceptable sins. And as I look at Ephesians chapter 4 and read this section that follows verse 16, I notice that there's a few things in there which are, we know we shouldn't do those things. But we don't really get worked up about them either. We certainly don't consider them as big a deal as some of the other big name sins, the frontline, the headlining sins, the ones we speak out about, the ones we work to root out of our lives. But acceptable sins matter, and they matter to God. So we're going to begin this week with Ephesians chapter 4, verses 16 to 24. This is sort of an introduction to the theme as a whole, because we need to understand what sins are and why they need to be identified. We need to have a bit of an introduction. Let's read together first Ephesians chapter 4, beginning in verse 16 and going through to verse 24. And I have two main points for us to hear this morning from this text. But first, hear the word of the Lord. From him, that is Jesus, the whole body, jointed and held together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself up in love as each part does its work. So I tell you this, and I insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do, in the futility of their thinking. They are darkened in their understanding and separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. Having lost all sensitivity, they have given themselves over to sensuality so as to indulge in every kind of impurity with a continual lust for more. You, however, did not come to know Christ that way. Surely you heard of him and were taught in him in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus. You were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted in its deceitful desires, to be made new in attitude of your minds, and to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. This is the word of the Lord, and we thank God for his word. Paul talks about the former way, the old life. He talks about putting on the new life. I want to point out to you that what Paul says in this passage is that Jesus brings us to a truth which is radically different from the lie we once knew and lived. And that's the first thing we need to identify in this passage, is that Jesus teaches truth. Jesus teaches truth. And in our world, that itself is a radical idea. And can I say something to you that you may like it or you may not, but it's something that we need to identify? What you feel, your preferences, do not change the objective, immovable nature of the creation or the Creator. How you feel about the world, what you prefer, even maybe what you have reasoned from your preferences and feelings, they do not change in the least truth. And that's an important concept to wrap our minds around, because if we don't get that, we're never going to understand what God says about sin. We're never going to understand his call away from the lies, the deception, the deceit. We're never going to get it. As Christians, so listen to this very carefully. As Christians, we should be prepared to hear things we don't like. If you go to church for year after year after year and you never hear anything from the pulpit that you don't like, either one of two things is true. Either you are a remarkable godly individual, that your will and God's will seem to run in complete parallel lines together, never crossing. Or you have not heard the full counsel of God preached. In fact, if I take what Paul says here seriously, and I realize what I used to be before I found Jesus, and I realize that there is an active taking off, therefore each of you must put off falsehood, Paul says. That's in verse 25. There are going to be times where the holiness of God meets me in my preferences, and they're going to conflict with one another. As a Christian, you should be prepared to hear things coming out of Scripture that you don't like. And that's why when we meet Jesus and he says challenging things, we need to learn to say, you're the king, I'm not. May your will be done. And if we really understand human nature, we're going to come to recognize that it is natural for people to love things that God forbids. and that they're going to resent when he commands against their preferences. If you go out into the world and expect everyone to hear the scripture preached and love what they hear, you really haven't taken seriously what God says about us as human beings. Read Romans chapter 1. We should recognize that it is human nature to love what we ought not love. Our fallen nature resents God when he forbids us the things we love. And by the way, it is possible to hate the same things God hates with impure motives. When we respond to people who are struggling with sin, it is possible for our indignation to come from a place other than a genuine desire for their good or God's glory. There are times where we go into the world and I hear people speaking out about this issue or this topic, and you can recognize the love of God is not motivating that speech or that position. Let me illustrate it in culinary terms. I had a friend, or I knew a gentleman when I was in seminary. He was from Ethiopia. And he once described to us some of the things they enjoy in his native land. And he once talked about the meat that they would eat and the way that they would eat it. And I thought to myself, please don't invite me to dinner. Now, that was a response based on my preferences and what I thought was normal or good. But it was a very subjective reaction to that description of their food. It was what I like. It was what I find disturbing or disgusting. It had nothing to do with the nutritional value of what he was describing, the food safety handling that would be involved in that process. Do you understand? Sometimes we as a church have reacted to cultural movements, not because the love of God motivated us to speak truth, but because we felt things were weird or they made us uncomfortable. And unless it is the love of God that propels us forward, unless we realize that Jesus teaches truth, and we're going to get to this a little bit later because this is really the heart of the message that we get. Unless it is the love of God that is pushing us forward and our desire that people come to Christ and find life, we're going to speak without that love. We're going to push back in our own human strength and with our own human wisdom. And in fact, we will be working against the purposes of God because God conquers by the cross. So what do we do recognizing that Jesus teaches us truth and that truth may not be necessarily compatible with our preferences? Well, there's another part to this that we need to recognize. When we think about sin and we think about the law of God, can I read to you what Paul says here about the futility of the way we used to think? It says that you, however, did not come to know Christ that way. Surely you heard of him and were taught by him in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus. You were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires. We are taught to put off the old self. And there's a reason for that. Because in verse 17, it says that you must walk like the Gentiles no longer, live as the Gentiles do in the futility of their thinking. Futility is not a great place to live. Have you ever tried to do something and it was futile? Have you ever tried to uncoil a rope that wasn't coiled properly when it was put away? Anybody ever done that? I did that this week. The knots and the tangles, and you work and you work and you work, and it doesn't matter how hard you work, the knots seem to just get tighter. And the tangles, there's always another one. It is a frustrating, futile effort. Jesus not only teaches us the truth, but he liberates us from futility. There is, in the long run, a practicality to obedience, though it often comes through pain, discomfort, sacrifice, and self-denial. So on the one hand, we preach truth, and this needs to be the first point. We preach truth because truth alone is worth holding on to and having. Jesus teaches us the truth. But we recognize that in preaching truth, we're also liberating people from the futility of the way they used to see the world. And Jesus calls us by his commands and his instructions to find something worth having and a way worth living. Can I give you an example of how this doesn't work? Or rather, can I give you an example of futility versus the way of the cross? Karl Marx wrote, now he wrote I think in German, this is an English translation, but you'll recognize the expression possibly. He wrote, from each according to ability and to each according to what? His need. Have you ever heard that expression before? From each according to his ability and to each according to his need. So basically, Karl Marx's statement is, you should give what you can give. And each should receive what he must or needs to receive. Do you hear how socialism is coming out of this, right? We all work as hard as we can for one another, and we all receive what we need from one another. I actually think that's a really great idea. Wouldn't it be nice if you went out and you gave according to your gifts, and you gave what you could? And wouldn't it be nice if you received what you needed? Everyone had what they needed because everyone worked together to contribute to the needs of others. Doesn't that even seem like a Christian ideal? Do you know the problem with that ideal? Is it doesn't work. It's a futile idea. Because if you tell me, forget about everyone else, forget about the world. Let's just talk about TJ for a second, okay? If you tell me that as long as I give my best, I will get everything I need, I might really be into that for a week or two. But you know what I notice? Is that when I go to work and I don't give quite 100%, I give 80%, I still get what I need. So I'm not really motivated to give 100%. So you know what? Maybe I can keep it going, but eventually, and I have noticed that if you're better than me, great. But human nature goes, and it doesn't give 100% 100% of the time. There is a futility built into this thinking, which does not recognize who God is and who we are as human beings. If you want to discuss political theory with me later, that's fine, that's fantastic. We're not, but do you see how the human idea leads us to futility? And only Jesus can take us back out again. That's why we preach the gospel. I'm going to skip over a whole bunch of my notes because we don't have time to hear them. And you know what? I'm sure they were great, but let's focus in on what matters. Here is the key. Here is the key. As we think about the fact that Jesus leads us to truth and Jesus delivers us from futility, here is the key. We do not preach Jesus, his commands, and his curriculum because we think ourselves better than our friends or our neighbors. In fact, God's good news begins with a level playing field. We all, even the best of us, start out as failures. We start in debt. We start with a negative score on the clock. Can you imagine that? Beginning a hockey game or a football game or any other sport, and up on the clock, visitors 0, home -52. That's where you and I begin our righteous life. We begin in debt. We preach Jesus not because we are better, but because we believe that in him we have finally found the truth that sets us free. We forbid behaviors and patterns of thought not from superstition or prejudice or personal preference. We don't even preach the forbiddenness of these behaviors because we are high-minded in our ideals. We preach these things because we haven't, the things we proclaim protect from ultimate futility about their promise and their fulfillment. The promises that they offer are a lie. The comforts and joys that they hold out are a cheat, and the actual result they bring are death and darkness. We preach Jesus not because we demand everyone to live up to our ideals of goodness, love, and virtue, but because today there is a free offer of life that is in harmony with the one who sang creation's being into existence, the one who spoke into the void, bringing light and matter to its nothingness. We fight our own desires and our longings, not because we are small-minded, not because we are fearful of these things, and fearful of things we may not understand, but because we believe that Jesus alone can give us life, a life worth living and having, a treasure worth holding on to and selling everything else to possess. We condemn sin in our own lives and preach repentance to others, because the greatest joy any human can ever know is to be finally restored by the grace of God. We live in a day that chooses scraps of relevance and self-worth, where mental illness is epidemic and society in general is crumbling. Everything has become polarized. Everything has become intensified, and yet so few of us are truly happy. Think about that. We live in a world where people are scrambling for these little bits and pieces of relevance and self-worth. If I can just be the best at this, if I can just bake my cake like the picture I saw, I'll finally be happy. Do you know how many happy people do you really know? Esau sold his inheritance for a birthright. His inheritance and his birthright for a hot meal, because he could think of nothing but the urgency of his stomach. Today's world is wrestling with a similar urgency and blindness. Though the enemy of our souls may target a different organ, his tactic remains the same. If you don't get what you want, you will never be happy. If God says no, he must really not love you. Remember the serpent's words. Did God really say? He knows when you eat it, you will actually be satisfied. You'll be like him. You'll be God for yourself, defining good and evil. Hear Paul. Down that road lies only futility, darkness, alienation, and corruption. Those are the words he used to describe that life. He talked about its darkness, its futility, its alienation, its corruption. You are being deceived. You are being destroyed. We reject sin because righteousness and holiness, God's rules, his instructions, his commands, they set us free to be what we were purpose-built for. It may be hard for you to hear in this ramshackle and frustrating world. It may be painful. It may be costly. It may even have the appearance of foolishness. But friend, I continue to preach, not because I'm smart or I'm skilled or even because I have finally reached some critical degree of spiritual excellence. I preach Jesus because he is the only thing worth having. Sin will kill us no matter how well it is bottled. Sin will kill us no matter how aggressively it is marketed. Sin will kill us no matter how smooth and sweet it tastes going down. You who choose against Jesus will have sufficient time in hell to consider how bad a bargain you have really made. And that's not a threat or a personal attack on you. I deserve hell just as much as any reprobate, criminal, or scoundrel you can name. I speak of hell not because I like it or even because I think scaring people with the subject is effective to get them to change their mind and their ways. Using hell to scare people into running to God is the suggestion that God would use terrorism to make people love him, right? No, the reason I talk about hell is because you have at this very moment the opportunity to put your fears to rest on the matter. Jesus spoke of it more than Paul or Peter, more than James or John. And Jesus spoke of it because he alone could save his hearers from experiencing it firsthand. He went through hell so you could have heaven. He offers you freedom, life, and peace because as a servant, he died to satisfy your rightful debt. Friend, hear me. Leave your sin behind. Jesus is the only thing that will satisfy you. Jesus teaches us truth. Jesus frees us from futility. And that is why these acceptable sins need to go.